In 1932, Ford built an engine so good that bank robbers wrote fan mail about it. It powered 15 million vehicles, launched an entire industry of speed shops, and turned backyard mechanics into American legends. Then Ford killed it. Not because it stopped working, because it worked too well for too long, and the world finally moved on without it. Before we get into why it died, you need to understand what it replaced and why it mattered. In the early 1930s, America was deep in the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, money was tighter, and if you wanted a V8 engine in your automobile, you needed serious wealth. Cadillac had one, LaSalle had one, Lincoln had one. These were luxury machines priced for the country club crowd, bolted together from multiple separate castings, expensive to manufacture, and completely out of reach for anyone who punched a clock. The average American drove a four-cylinder, or, if they were fortunate, an inline-six. That was the ceiling for working-class motorists. 8 cylinders was a fantasy. Henry Ford decided to change that. Ford had already proven with the Model T that transformative ideas belonged in ordinary hands. He'd made the automobile itself affordable. Now he wanted to democratize what lived under the hood. The obstacle was manufacturing. Every V8 on the market used a complicated multi-piece construction. Separate cylinder blocks bolted to separate crankcases, sometimes cylinders cast in pairs or even individually, then assembled with dozens of fasteners. It functioned. It also cost a fortune to produce. Nobody had figured out how to mass-produce a V8 cheaply enough to sell alongside four-cylinder economy cars. Ford, stubborn as always, decided he would figure it out personally, and he meant that almost literally. While Ford Motor Company had a capable engineering team, many of the core concepts for the new engine originated with Henry himself. He handpicked 5 of his best engineers to execute his vision: Carl Schmaltz, Ray Lard, Emil Zorlein, Don Sullivan, and a few others who rotated through the project. They were sworn to absolute secrecy. The development ran from roughly 1926 through 1932, and what they were attempting had the broader industry convinced it was an engineering impossibility. They wanted to cast all 8 cylinders and the entire crankcase as a single piece of iron, one block, one casting, one pour, no bolting separate cylinder banks together, no multi-piece bottom ends. If they could pull it off, it would slash manufacturing costs and make the V8 engine accessible to farmers, factory workers, and anyone else who could scrape together a few $100s. The casting itself was the monumental challenge. A 90-degree V8 block with integrated oil galleries, coolant passages, intake runners, exhaust passages, and even the flywheel housing, all formed from a single iron pour. The foundry precision required was beyond anything anyone had achieved at mass production scale. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, drove the strategy of integrating as many components as possible into that single, elaborate casting: less machining, less assembly, lower cost, in theory. In practice, the early attempts were a disaster. The first production engines came off the line on March 9, 1932. They were rough. Casting pinholes that leaked oil, cracked blocks from core shifts that left some cylinder walls dangerously thin, chronic overheating that no amount of adjustment seemed to fix. Oil consumption so severe that without frequent top-ups, the entire forecourt capacity could vanish before the first tank of fuel was gone. The fuel pump was prone to vapor lock in summer and freezing in winter. The motor earned an immediate reputation as an oil burner. People were returning engines within 1,000 miles. Not exactly the revolution Ford had promised, but Ford had invested $50 million in this project. In today's money, that's well over $1 billion. There was no turning back. Sorensen developed new casting methods that reduced the cracking. Henry Ford, who could be phenomenally stubborn about his design preferences, eventually relented on a few of his less successful demands, including the original single-plane intake manifold and the unusual high-mounted water pumps. By 1934, the V8 had become a reasonably trustworthy engine, not perfect, not even close, but good enough. The original engine displaced 221 cubic inches. Bore was 3.0625 inches. Stroke was 3.75 inches. Compression was a conservative 5.5 to 1. Output was 65 horsepower at 3,400 RPM. For context, the outgoing Model A made 40 horsepower. The Model B four-cylinder made 50. Chevrolet's overhead valve inline-six made 60. Ford's new V8 beat every affordable competitor on power, and it was notably lighter and more compact than the Chevy 6. The entire car cost between $460 and $650. In today's money, roughly $10,000 to $14,000 for a V8. Nearly 100,000 customers placed orders sight unseen before the first Model 18 even hit showroom floors. It outsold the four-cylinder Model B by more than 2 to 1. Ford had his revolution. Now, about that fan mail from criminals. In April of 1934, Henry Ford's office in Detroit received a handwritten letter postmarked from Tulsa, Oklahoma. The writer identified himself as Clyde Champion Barrow. Yes, that Clyde Barrow. Half of the most notorious criminal duo in American history. The letter was brief and blunt. Barrow said he drove Fords exclusively when he could get away with one. He praised the V8 for sustained speed and freedom from trouble, saying it had every other car beaten. He acknowledged his business was not strictly legal, but that didn't diminish his appreciation for the product. Ford, apparently taking the letter at face value, had his secretary draft a thank you reply and mail it to Clyde care of General Delivery in Tulsa. Clyde never received it. He'd already moved on. 6 weeks later, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were killed in an ambush in Louisiana, caught in a devastating volley of gunfire. They were sitting in a stolen 1934 Ford V8. The car absorbed over 100 bullet holes. It still exists today, on display at a resort in Primm, Nevada, bloodstains and all. The letter's authenticity has been debated for decades. Handwriting analysts have noted it looks more like Bonnie Parker's writing than Clyde's. His family pointed out the signature read Clyde Champion Barrow, when his actual middle name was Chestnut. Historians still argue about it. But genuine or not, the story cemented something real. The Flathead V8 had become more than an engine. It was a symbol of speed, accessible power, and a certain kind of American defiance. By 1934, Ford had added a two-barrel Stromberg carburetor and switched from forged to cast steel crankshafts, a pioneering move that cut costs without sacrificing strength. Ford patented these casting methods. Horsepower climbed to 85. Reliability improved with each model year. By 1935, Ford had produced over 2 million Flathead V8s. By 1936, over 3 million. In 1937, buyers got a choice between aluminum and cast iron heads. Cast iron gave a higher 7.5 to 1 compression and 94 horsepower. That same year, Ford introduced the little V860, a 136 cubic inch version rated at 60 horsepower. Designed for European markets where displacement taxes were steep, it never caught on in American passenger cars. Too little power for the vehicle weight. But it became a weapon in midget racing, breaking the Offenhauser engine's dominance in that class. And here is where the story takes a turn nobody at Ford headquarters anticipated. People were racing these engines immediately. In 1933, less than a year after the Flathead debuted, modified versions were already setting records at the Elgin National Road Race. By 1934, Flatheads were running 109-mile-per-hour laps at the Indianapolis 500. In 1936, Flathead-powered racers took the podium at the first Daytona Beach stock car race. Before the engine was 5 years old, it was dominating nearly every form of amateur competition in America. The reason was the engine's elegant simplicity. In a flathead design, the valves sit in the block beside the cylinders, actuated directly by the camshaft through solid lifters. No push rods, no rocker arms, no complicated valve train up in the head. The head itself is essentially a lid. Any reasonably competent mechanic could tear one of these apart, rebuild it, and modify it on a workbench with hand tools. From 1937 onward, the replaceable shell main bearings made overhauls even simpler and cheaper. The barrier to entry was practically zero. Then came 1939 and a significant evolution. Mercury, Ford's new mid-price brand, needed more muscle. Engineers extended the stroke to 3.1875 inches, raising displacement to 239 cubic inches. Output jumped to 95 horsepower with 170 pound-feet of torque. The Mercury version used heavier connecting rods, a beefier crankshaft, and larger main bearings. That Mercury crank, with its longer stroke, became one of the most sought-after hot rod parts in existence. Drop a Merc crank into a standard Ford block, and you had instant displacement increase. Hot rodders figured this out almost immediately. By 1939, production had passed 6 million units. Then the world went to war. Civilian car production stopped completely. Ford converted everything to military output. Flatheads powered trucks, staff cars, and various military vehicles across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Development froze. But the servicemen maintaining those engines in the field were getting an education they'd carry home. They learned how engines worked, how to diagnose problems under pressure, how to improvise repairs with whatever was available. And when they came home, they brought those hard-won skills with them. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The war ends. Millions of young men return with mechanical expertise, mustering out pay in their pockets, and a restlessness that peaceful civilian life wasn't quite soothing. New cars were nearly impossible to buy. Factories hadn't finished converting back from wartime production. But used Fords were everywhere, cheap, plentiful, and powered by a V8 that practically demanded modification. What happened next created an entire culture. Hot rodding had roots before the war. People had been racing modified Fords on dry lake beds since the mid-1930s, and a handful of speed shops had begun selling go-fast parts before Pearl Harbor. But after 1945, the movement detonated. It wasn't gradual. It was an explosion of pent-up energy and newly acquired skills meeting a massive surplus of cheap, modifiable cars. The formula was simple and deeply American. Take a 1920s or 30s Ford. The most popular starting points were Model Ts, Model As, and the 32 Ford, which hot rodders simply called the Deuce. Strip the fenders, remove the running boards, pull off the windshield, chop the top if you were ambitious, channel the body down over the frame rails to lower the profile, shed every unnecessary ounce, drop in the hottest flathead you could build, and head for the desert. It started as illegal street racing in and around Los Angeles, kids racing on Sepulveda Boulevard, wherever there was a straight enough stretch of pavement after dark. Police cracked down. The racing moved out of the city into the Mojave Desert. In Southern California, the dry lake beds were the proving grounds. El Mirage, Muroc, which later became Edwards Air Force Base. Flat, sun-scorched expanses of cracked earth where you could point a car at the horizon and hold the throttle open until your nerves or your engine gave out first. Racing clubs formed with names like the Sidewinders and the Roadrunners. The Southern California Timing Association organized events, established rules, and recorded official speeds. Timing tags bolted to dashboards served as trophies. The Flathead V8 powered almost every car that showed up. Vic Edelbrock Sr. bought a 1932 Ford Roadster in 1938 and drove it to the Dry Lakes, where he clocked 112 miles per hour. When stock parts couldn't deliver the speed he wanted, he designed his own aluminum intake manifold. He called it the Slingshot, a 180-degree manifold for dual Stromberg 97 carburetors. He produced about 100 of them before the war. After the war, demand exploded. That manifold launched a company that still makes performance parts today. And Edelbrock was just the first domino. Ed Iskandarian, who everyone called Iski, started grinding custom camshafts for Flatheads out of a modest shop. He'd been fascinated by speed since watching modified Fords run at the Dry Lakes before the war, and he built his business around the idea that a hotter cam profile could wake up a Flathead without tearing the bottom end apart. Tommy Thickstun designed high-rise intake manifolds that became staples of the street and strip scene. Offenhauser made multi-carb intake systems. Kong Jackson built tubular headers to replace the strangled stock exhaust manifolds. Navarro Engineering produced heads and manifolds. The most popular carburetor setup was multiple Stromberg 97s, those compact two-barrel carburetors that could be lined up 3 or 4 abreast on a manifold. 3 deuces, 4 deuces, sometimes 6. The sight of a row of chrome air cleaners sitting on top of a Flathead became the defining visual of the hot rod era. Stu Hilborn developed mechanical fuel injection and used it on a Flathead-powered streamliner that exceeded 146 miles per hour on the Dry Lakes. Alex Zidius, a former B-17 flight engineer, opened the SoCal Speed Shop in Burbank. He teamed with Dean Batchelor, a former B-17 gunner who later became an editor at Road and Track, to build a streamliner for the first hot rod meet at Bonneville in 1949. They used a belly tank chassis, the teardrop-shaped auxiliary fuel tank from a P-38 fighter, rebodied it with a custom streamlined shell, and installed an Edelbrock-built Mercury Flathead. The belly tank became an icon of Bonneville racing, and the Flathead was at the center of it. In January of 1948, the first major hot rod exhibition opened at the National Guard Armory in Los Angeles. Robert Peterson walked the floor distributing copies of the first issue of Hot Rod magazine. The cover car was a flamed, Flathead-powered Model T Roadster that had run 136 miles per hour at El Mirage. The following year, the first organized drag race happened between 2 Ford V8s in Goleta, near Santa Barbara. Tom Cobbs was the favorite in a supercharged 34 Roadster. He lost to Edelbrock shop manager Fran Hernandez in a 32 Coupe running 3 carburetors and a closely guarded secret additive, nitromethane. Nobody discussed that publicly for years. All of this, the speed shops, the magazines, the timing associations, the aftermarket parts industry that would eventually generate billions in annual revenue. All of it grew directly from one engine. Now let's talk about why it was fundamentally doomed. The Flathead gets its name because the cylinder head is essentially flat. Just a cover plate with combustion chamber recesses machined into it. The valves sit in the block, next to the cylinders, pointing upward. The cam drives them directly through solid lifters. Simple, cheap, easy to work on, and thermally catastrophic. Here's the problem. In a Flathead, intake air enters the block, passes the intake valve, and then has to travel up, over, and down into the cylinder. It follows a tortuous, inefficient path. Exhaust does the same thing in reverse, doubling back and interfering with incoming fresh charge on its way out. Modern engines rotate intake and exhaust on opposite sides of the head for clean unidirectional flow. The Flathead crammed everything through the same cramped space. 2 consequences were inescapable. First, the engine couldn't breathe. Volumetric efficiency was inherently poor. You could bolt on every carburetor in the catalog and eventually hit a wall because air simply could not navigate those passages fast enough. Second, The exhaust passages ran directly through the engine block, winding through the water jacket on their way to outboard manifolds. Hot exhaust gases, hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, coursing through cast iron channels surrounded by coolant. The center two cylinders on each bank shared a single Siamese exhaust port, meaning those four cylinders ran chronically hotter than the outer four. The cooling system was under constant, enormous strain. Ford never fully cleared the residual casting sand from the water jackets either. Over time, it solidified and restricted coolant flow, compounding the overheating. Compression ratio was capped by the architecture. The combustion chamber was the space beside and above the piston where the valves lived. Opening it up for better breathing reduced compression. The engine spent most of its life between 6:1 and 6.8:1. The final Mercury version reached 7.2:1. That was the ceiling without abandoning the Flathead concept entirely. The three main bearing crankshaft saved manufacturing cost but limited high RPM potential. Every one of these constraints was baked in from day one, unfixable without a completely different engine. And yet people made remarkable power from Flatheads anyway. The aftermarket learned every trick, porting and polishing the rough sand-cast passages, milling heads for higher compression, aluminum aftermarket heads, multiple carburetor setups, hotter camshafts, headers replacing the choked stock exhaust manifolds. The most legendary modification was the Ardun overhead valve conversion. Zora Arkus Duntov and his brother Yuri designed it in the late 1940s. The name was a contraction of Arkus Duntov. Zora had pitched Ford on an overhead valve conversion to solve the overheating and breathing problems in 1945. Ford showed zero interest, so Zora built it himself. The Ardun heads featured hemispherical combustion chambers, individual exhaust ports, and dramatically improved airflow. They preceded the Chrysler Hemi by 4 years. A stock 239-inch Flathead made about 100 horsepower. Ardun heads pushed that to 150 or 160 in street tune and roughly 200 in race trim. On alcohol, specialists at CT Automotive extracted 267 horsepower. On nitromethane, over 300. From 65 stock horses, only about 200 to 250 sets were ever produced at $500 each. Too expensive, too few, too late. But legendary. Zora later joined General Motors and became known as the father of the Corvette. He wrote a famous internal memo urging GM to appeal to the hot rod youth market. The irony was thick. The man who tried to save Ford's Flathead ended up building the car that would help Chevrolet steal Ford's performance crown. The killing blow came as a parade, not a single punch. In 1949, Cadillac and Oldsmobile both introduced overhead valve V8s. The Cadillac made 160 horsepower from similar displacement, where Ford managed 100. Overhead valves meant superior breathing, cleaner exhaust routing, higher compression, and drastically less overheating. In 1951, Chrysler dropped the Firepower Hemi. By 54, it made 235 horsepower, more than double the Flathead's best. Then, in 1955, Chevrolet unveiled the small block V8, compact, light, affordable. 162 horsepower stock with massive modification potential. The Chevy small block did to the Flathead exactly what the Flathead had done to the four-cylinder, and the hot rod community noticed immediately. A stock Cadillac or Olds overhead valve V8, pulled from a wrecked car at the junkyard, could outperform a seriously built Flathead without breaking a sweat. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was spray-painted in letters 10 feet tall. Hot rodders, being practical people above all else, started pulling Flatheads and dropping in overhead valve engines. By the mid-1950s, the transition was well underway. The Flathead didn't disappear overnight, far from it, but the new engines offered so much more headroom for modification that the migration was inevitable. Ford saw it coming. By 1952, their own overhead valve inline-six made 101 horsepower, nearly matching the Flathead V8. They bumped the V8 to 110 that year just to stay ahead of their own six. The final American Flathead, the 1953 255 cubic inch Mercury, made 125 horsepower, the pinnacle, already obsolete. On January 6, 1954, Ford introduced the Y-block V8, overhead valves, better cooling, more power. The Flathead was dead in America, but not everywhere. Canada and Australia continued through 54. Simca in France built them until 61 for cars, 64 in Brazil. And a French military truck, the Simca Unique Marmont Bouquet, kept the Flathead in production until 1990. The engine, designed in secret during the Depression, was still being manufactured when the Berlin Wall came down. The Flathead's legacy runs deeper than nostalgia. It created the automotive aftermarket as we know it. Edelbrock, Iskandarian, Offenhauser, Holley's Performance Line, Navarro. These companies trace their origin stories directly to the Flathead era. Before the Flathead, there was no consumer speed equipment industry. A few specialty shops served race teams, but there was nothing resembling a mass market for performance parts. The Flathead created that market because there were millions of identical engines out there, all accepting the same bolt-on modifications. Standardization at massive scale made the aftermarket possible. And once those companies existed, they didn't disappear when the Flathead died. They adapted. They started making parts for the Chevy small block, for the Ford Windsor, for whatever the next popular engine platform was. The industry the Flathead created is still generating billions in annual revenue today. It created hot rod culture, not just the racing, but the entire philosophy of mechanical self-reliance. The conviction that an ordinary person with hand tools could transform a slow car into something extraordinary. That ethos started with the Flathead because Ford designed it to be simple enough for a farmer to repair, and hot rodders exploited that simplicity to build race cars in home garages. The do-it-yourself tradition that drives car culture today traces a direct line back to veterans rebuilding Flatheads on sawhorses in Southern California driveways. It created automotive journalism as a mass medium. Hot Rod magazine survived its early years because Flathead speed equipment companies bought advertising. The publishing ecosystem that grew around performance cars traced directly to the culture the Flathead spawned. Without the Flathead, no Hot Rod magazine. Without Hot Rod, the entire landscape of enthusiast automotive media looks completely different. It also proved a principle that shaped the industry for the next century. An affordable engine with a passionate aftermarket following creates brand loyalty that outlasts the product itself. Ford's Flathead was replaced by the Y-block, which was replaced by the FE series, which gave way to the Windsor and Cleveland small blocks. Each generation carried forward the principle Henry Ford established in 1932. Power to the people. Today, modified Flatheads have been pushed past 400 horsepower on gasoline and over 700 on race fuel, all from an engine with 3 main bearings and a design flaw nobody could fully solve. Ward's rated it one of the 10 best engines of the 20th century. More than 15 million were built in the United States alone. The French built them for 50 years total. And the sound of a built Flatty running through lake pipes is still one of the most distinctive, beautiful noises in all of car culture. If you've ever heard it, you don't forget it. That low mechanical rumble that sounds like something alive and slightly angry. The traditional hot rod movement keeps the Flathead relevant. Builders who want period-correct machines insist on Flathead power. Events like the Race of Gentlemen on the beach at Wildwood, New Jersey, require vintage engines. Flatheads are the stars. New aftermarket parts are still being manufactured. You can buy freshly cast aluminum heads, new intake manifolds, reproduction Stromberg carburetors, and virtually everything else you need to build a Flathead from scratch. 90-some years after the first one came off the line, the supply chain is still alive. Here is what still gets me. The engine that built hot rodding, that created the aftermarket industry, that bank robbers endorsed, and soldiers modified, and teenagers raced across dried-out lake beds, this engine was considered technically obsolete by automotive engineers the day it was introduced. In 1932, everyone already knew overhead valves were the future. Chevrolet had been building one since 1929. The Flathead was old thinking before the first one left Dearborn. It just did not matter. Because it was cheap, simple, powerful enough, and everywhere. Sometimes the most advanced technology doesn't win. Sometimes the most accessible one does. The Ford Flathead V8 didn't need to be the best engine of its era. It just needed to be the one that ordinary people could afford, understand, and make their own. Ford killed the Flathead because physics and progress demanded it. But what the Flathead built is still running. Every speed shop, every hot rod show, every kid who pops a hood and thinks they could make it go faster. That impulse started here. With 65 horsepower and a block full of compromises, casting sand, and pure stubborn American ambition. And that's the story of the Ford Flathead V8. Still, can't believe a bank robber wrote Henry Ford a thank you note from a stolen car, and Ford wrote him back. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. More coming soon.